Icelandic or English? Or
Both, já, either or, já. Ég byrja bara á íslenskunni, þetta fer frá mennsku. Anna ekki búin að læra íslensku, ekki einu sinni eitt orð. En þykir óskaplega væntum, okkur í Kennslumiðstöð finnst óskaplega væntum að sjá þennan fjölda fólki. Alveg sama hvar ég bar niður, þá sagði allir það dagur íslenskrar tungu við að Víkingssonar spila í hádeginu, það þetta og það hitt og þetta mjög mikill athafnadagur. Þannig að gott að sjá að margir hafa ákveðið að koma. Og við hjá Kennslumiðstöð við erum bara mjög stolt af því að fá hingað til lands Dr. AnnaJones. Hún vinnur við reyndar viðskipta og hagfræðideild í Melbourne háskóla. Það sem hún vinnur að þróa kennsluhætti. Og það sem rannsóknir sem hún ætlar að skoða segja okkur aðeins frá í dag, tengist því sem við í Háskóla Íslands erum nú að fara að gera. Hæfniviðmið og learning outcome eins og þið þekki í tengslu meðal annars við Bologna. Þar hafa Evrópusinnar svolítið sagt að þeir sem að standa fyrir þeim umræðum að tala um mikilvægi gagnrýna hugsun sem í háskólanámi og það markmið að efla gagnrýna hugsun nemenda og tala dálítið svona eins og það sé ekki tengt neinni fræðigrein. Að gagnrýna hugsun sé bara hægt að efla per se. Og svo Anna fór á stað og rannsakaði hvort að gagnrýnin hugsun væri það sama í ólíkum deildum og á ólíkum fræðasviðum. Og þetta rannsóknin sem hún ætlar að segja frá í dag. Anna, I'm really pleased to have you here. I briefly tried to tell them what I think you're doing.
Well, I wouldn't know since I don't understand what you're saying. You could be saying anything.
So we're just very happy to have you
Thank you.
And please put us into the truth about critical thinking.
Well, I wouldn't go quite so. Telling the truth might be a bit ambitious because I don't think there is a single truth. So I guess if you're here for the truth, then I might be disappointing you. But thank you very much, Guru. As I said, I can only trust that she said nice things about me, and she's a good friend. So, and I'm very sorry that I'm having to do this in English. I have to apologise, but it's my only language, I'm afraid. I'm going to talk to you today about a study which looked at critical thinking and what it is in a disciplinary context. And I started my study really because, at least in the Australian and British North American context, which was the context that I was looking at, and I know also in a European context, because I think you were talking about Bologna, the Bologna processes and the Dublin descriptors. Critical thinking is something that was coming up all the time, but I felt that it was something that was unproblematized, that people were saying, yes, critical thinking is a good idea, yes, critical thinking is essential to higher education, yes, we do critical thinking in our discipline, but nobody, at least in the field of higher education, I'm sure perhaps in other fields it is examined more carefully, but at least in the higher education literature and the higher education policy, it was a term that was thrown around fairly glibly without being carefully examined. And so I thought, okay, if we're going to claim that it's important, we need to know what we're looking at. I looked at only 5 disciplines. I know I have to acknowledge this is a limitation of my study, but I chose these 5 disciplines because they do have a well-established disciplinary culture, a long research tradition, and people who've talked to me subsequently about my study have said, but it's going to be different in other disciplines. Sure, yes, it is, and I'm happy to acknowledge that. I have to also say at the outset that I only looked at 2 universities in an Australian context. They were 2 fairly similar universities. They were big, research-intensive, fairly traditional universities. And so what I'm saying, again, has these limits on it, that they were the particular disciplinary cultures of those 2 universities. And so I'm not claiming to be making very broad general statements, although I think that what I have to say is still interesting, but bear those limitations in mind. What I did was interviewed academic staff in these disciplines, in-depth interviews. My interviews ranged from between about an hour and an hour and a half, and on occasions I went back and talked to them again. And what I wanted to look at was the way that the disciplinary cultures shaped the way that people understood critical thinking. Now, I think it's partly the epistemologies of the disciplines, but also the disciplinary cultures, the more broader culture of the discipline, the research cultures, the teaching cultures, and the departmental cultures. Now, I don't actually specifically look at the departmental cultures and the institutional cultures in this study, but again, I have to acknowledge that they have an important role, although it's not something that I focused on deliberately. Now, I know we're sort of organised in formal rows, which doesn't always encourage interaction, but please, I'm more than happy. If you want to interrupt me or ask a question at any stage, don't feel that you have to leave it till the last minute. Is that okay?
Yes.
Please just interrupt me. I'm really happy with that, and I'm much happier if it's a conversation. So, yeah, please feel free. The disciplines that I looked at were different, but there were some interesting interconnections. Obviously, law and medicine were vocational. Economics was not really seen by the two departments that I interviewed as a vocational degree, but clearly a lot of students who studied economics went out to be economists in government or business. History and economics share a lot of a common tradition. Historians, there are many historians who draw on economic theory, and some economists who have a historical background, obviously. They're both interested in society, social change, and the causes of change. Physics and economics, interestingly, also share a tradition in that a lot of economics, as many of you I'm sure know, has at least in the past drawn on ideas of certainly 19th century physics. I think that's changing in economics, and I'm sure some of you are much more knowledgeable about both physics and economics than I am. I don't claim to be experts in any of the 5 areas that I looked at. I do have a social science background, but I deliberately chose 5 disciplines where I didn't have a lot of knowledge because I wanted to sort of look at them as an innocent outsider. And so if you are historians, physicists, economists, medical scientists, some of this may seem somewhat naive, and I guess in some ways that was deliberate. Law was interesting because it was a mixture of both axiomatic. Certainly in Australia, we rely on both case law and statute law, but it was also interpretive. So while there were positive rules, there were also case law interpretations. And medicine, again, a very interesting discipline because it's based on bioscience, but also an element of the art of medicine, the art of communication, the art of taking a medical history. So they were all quite different but had interesting relationships. The notion of skills is again a highly contested area, and contested from a number of different areas. The idea of, is it a cognitive skill? Is it an attribute that changes one as a person? Is it about one's technical abilities, or is it about a much deeper ontology about who you are, how you understand your sense of being in the world? There are a number of queries from theorists about whether skills actually can exist outside a context or not. So these questions were all raised when I started thinking about critical thinking. And that idea that you can't think critically without having some knowledge, that you must think critically about something. I couldn't think critically you know, about chemistry, because all I've got is high school chemistry. I can recite the periodic table, but that's about all. So how could I possibly think critically in the field of chemistry? I know nothing. So again, one needs a body of knowledge in order to intelligently think critically. I mean, we could do what tabloids do, tabloid newspapers do, and have an opinion about everything, but I don't think that's our role in the university. And then there's the contradiction between ideas about learning being situated, learning existing in its context and being shaped by its context, and yet the assumption that is made in a lot of areas that critical thinking is cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, is something that once you've developed it, you can use it in many contexts. And to me, they were contradictory ideas. If learning is situated, if we believe that learning is situated, how then do we make sense of the idea that, oh yes, well, we can learn it in one context and then transfer it to a workplace with ease? I'm not saying it can't be done at all, but I think there are these complex questions. So these were all the questions that were flying around as I was considering my study. In the literature, there's an old, long-running debate, at least in some American literature, about whether critical thinking is a generic skill, or whether it's generalisable, or whether it's specific. Other theorists have considered critical thinking to be three-layered, that it's about problem solving and a logical approach to argument, or it's about the debates that rage within a discipline that is very contextualised. Ron Barnett, a prominent higher education writer and thinker, argues that it's also metacritique. It's raising one out of the disciplinary debates and into thinking about a much more transformative notion of critical thinking that's about notions of power. And it draws on ideas from Habermas and such like. Yes?
May I ask you, did you include in the problem-solving category, so to speak, argumentation?
Yes, I think yes, I would, yes. Argumentation, logic, yeah. But I would also argue that as well as being, and I think those are three rather crude layers, and I don't see them as discrete, actually. I mean, you probably can't engage in metacritique without problem solving, so I certainly wouldn't see them as discrete layers, but as interconnected. But I think they're a helpful way of thinking about critical thinking, and I wouldn't argue that they're hierarchical either. I don't suggest one is better or worse than the other. As well, I would also suggest that critical thinking is embedded, often, but not always, tacit and organic. I think that as teachers, when I was interviewing a lot of the academic staff, they had very clear ideas about what critical thinking was in their research. But when I talked to them about, well, how do you teach critical thinking? Many of them said, oh, students just pick it up. Yeah, they learn it along the way. Pick it up along as they're going, but it's and I said, well, but what actually is it for undergraduates? And that was a lot more difficult, and some people said, oh, I think we're terrible at teaching critical thinking. I'm not sure that I would agree that they're terrible. I mean, I think that's being way too humble. But I think often part of what critical thinking is that it's tacit, it's very much embedded in the way that people are thinking, disciplinary thinking. And it's organic in that it's tied in with practice, perhaps research technique, laboratory etiquette. Historians, it's about the process of seeking out archival material. So it's embedded in the content, it's embedded in practice, embedded in thinking and reasoning and understanding as well. So I realised, I guess, once I started thinking about disciplinary cultures, disciplinary epistemology, disciplinary practices and critical thinking, I realised that I had got myself into quite a complex situation. And the more I thought about it, the more I realised how complex it was, particularly given that I didn't have those deep disciplinary understandings, that I could tease them out. But I was still operating at a great distance. And I was aware of the more I knew, the more I knew I didn't know. And I think there's a very complex relationship between not only the teacher's epistemology and the teacher's own beliefs about knowledge and the students. And sometimes that, again, at least in my own institution, is continually being negotiated and renegotiated. And I think also that there are sometimes differences between an academic's epistemology, the way people think about knowledge in terms of their own research and their own discipline and their own understandings, and how they think about knowledge when they're thinking about teaching. It was interesting talking to the physicists that when they talked about ideas as physicists, they had an extremely complex, sophisticated understanding of knowledge, of uncertainty, of how ideas are constructed. But when it came to teaching, at least teaching undergraduates, there were certain certainties that needed to be, and I think it's a matter of necessity, it's not that they were being simplistic, there were certain certainties, because it's a mature science, that needed to be conveyed to students. And so the students might have got the idea that knowledge was certain and clear, and as one person put it, shrink-wrapped, textbook type knowledge, whereas that wasn't their own personal understanding of knowledge, which was much more sophisticated. But getting that across to an undergraduate, when all they're trying to do is to understand, thermodynamics, is really, or even the mathematical skills to deal with this stuff, is really interesting. And so the idea that the social nature of knowledge, that knowledge is understood in different ways by different people in different contexts, and can actually be that I wasn't suggesting that there was a single epistemology for a discipline. That would be way too simplistic, and I would run, very quickly from that idea. But nor even was there a single epistemology for an individual, or even for a particular context. And so it was still further layers of complexity, and people would say, oh yes, we do one thing with our postgraduates, one thing with our PhD research group, but quite another in terms of critical thinking and thinking about knowledge and thinking about how you critique knowledge, quite another with our first year undergraduates. So again, that idea of what is critical thinking was very different for an 18-year-old who was new to university and a PhD student just about to graduate. In history, again, I'm wary of making generalisations, but in history there was very little paradigm consensus. And yet, paradoxically, while all the historians I spoke to said, no, we don't agree about anything. No, there are as many different opinions as there are officers in this building. But of all the people I talked to, they all said the same things. So while there was a lot of agreement in their disagreement. So that was very interesting. They said, yes, lack of consensus sits very comfortably. No, we don't agree, but no, we don't fight about it. It's fine. No, we don't have the same approach, but that's fine. We like disagreeing. That's all quite comfortable. But when I asked them about what critical thinking was, and I'll come to that in in a few slides, they all told me exactly the same thing. And they range from really very senior historians who were at the very end of their career to very young people who were fairly recently out of their PhDs, men and women, teaching a range of histories from modern Australian history to medieval British history, Asian history, German history. So there was a real range. They all argued there are many histories, there's no one story. History is about the multiple, the many stories. It's about seeking out that complexity. It's about the ephemeral. It's about the other. It's about grabbing something that was real but is real no longer. Of all the disciplines, it was the most self-conscious. Historians were the most aware that they were constructing an argument, that they were the tool for their own theories, and were very aware of, they were very self-critical, very self-conscious, and very aware of their own place in their arguments. And saw critical thinking very much as about critiquing their own process. Physics had the power of a very powerful discipline in that they were aware much of the physics worldview has shaped Western thinking. Very conscious of the power of their thinking for both good and evil, for technological change, that it had a sort of a kudos that really no other discipline had, that they felt that, But at the same time, in Australian universities anyway, had been reduced to small dark offices, didn't have a lot of power, a lot of money in the university. Were quite aware that most of their graduates couldn't get jobs as research physicists that went into banking, actuarial studies, insurance, meteorology, spying, all sorts of interesting things. Yes, I'm not quite sure what they're doing, but a high level of consensus at one level. But also a consciousness that level of consensus and acceptance hadn't always been there. As one person said, well, at least they're not burning us at the stake anymore. But that they hadn't always been quite as comfortable. There aren't heretics anymore, but Galileo's not so long ago. For economics, in the schools that I talked to, again, there was a high level of consensus amongst the economists that I spoke to. They did acknowledge that there was newer theories coming through, such as behavioural and developmental economics, but that economics was still, the big journals were still dominated by a neoclassical paradigm. Now, it'll be interesting given the current crisis and the fact that everybody seems to have become Keynesians again. It'll be interesting to think about what the economists have got to say about that. But I don't know. I'll wait till I get home. I work in an economics and commerce faculty, so yeah.
I work in business.
Yeah.
So I teach what would fall more under organizational theory, behavioral economics. I find it very hard to do that without starting neoclassical. So it seems that even if we have departed from the neoclassic model, we somehow still have to start there to be able to make our case.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, certainly in the school where I work, we teach, the students can't do anything until they've done introductory microeconomics, introductory macroeconomics. And yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because some people have said to me, well, this is usually the slide that people go, oh, no, it's not like this in my institution. And I'm conscious that it was only 2 institutions, but most of the people I spoke to said if, we won't get published in the big journals. If we're too critical, we're branded as heretics. Well, one person said, I'm the heretic, I'm really critical of the dominant paradigm, but people see me as, almost the Antichrist. That he's not somebody to be taken too seriously, he's dangerous. And actually, he did leave the university and went to another university fairly soon after, so some of this might have been tinged with perhaps a touch of, other things, but I don't know. It was interesting because the economist said, we are the science of the social sciences. We have a good methodology, we're strong methodologically. All the rest of the social sciences, as one person described it, into that soft hand-waving stuff. We've got some methodological power. The one and a half person who was critical said methodological power. Economists can't predict anything with any certainty. They might think they've got really strong models, but these models are based on, assumptions which are shaky, to say the least. I'm not making any value judgments here. I'm merely reporting, so please don't shoot me down as an apologist or an attacker of the economists. I'm reporting what people say. But that was interesting. That the two people who, one person was very critical of his own discipline. One said, it's a bit dodgy, but it's quite fun. Law was interesting because it was sort of slipped all over the place. Again, very little consensus. There were what they refer to themselves as the black letter lawyers, very positivist approach to law. These are the rules, these are the cases, we interpret it in very formal ways. And then any social science approach from that through, you could, there were post-structuralists. There was everybody within the two schools that I talked to. And the importance of language, of course, because the whole basis of law is language. There's nothing else but language. And at least in Australian Westminster style law, the way that language is interpreted. And medicine, the bioscience, the reliance on evidence-based medicine, and yet the importance of the psychosocial, the contextual, the personal, the individual, the fact that, the clear knowledge that although there was evidence about, based on drug trials, you could still use the same drug in everybody in this room and we would all respond in slightly different ways, or in some cases very different ways. And that uncertainty, the fact that, the psychological has a big effect, lifestyle has a big effect, and understanding the ethical and normative roles of medicine and the importance of that, the role of the professional enculturation, that really, unlike any of the other disciplines that I spoke to, being a medical student was about being enculturated into a profession, learning to be a doctor, and all the persona of being a doctor. And the fact that medicine isn't a discipline, a single discipline anyway. Although people argued that it had, I said, well, is it a discipline? Am I sort of heading on the wrong track? And they said, oh, absolutely, we are a discipline. We have a lot in common. But that somebody, an oncologist studying cancer wouldn't really know very much about, paediatrics unless they were a paediatric oncologist. So the specialists were so different. And medicine was such a huge field that no one person could ever get their head around the whole field. And so, I think here there are a number of similarities. I was using the terms. I know that you could actually argue that perhaps some of these terms are the same. I was using the terms that came up most often that the respondents themselves used. So although you could probably argue that argument analysis and logic and problem solving are similar things, I'm just using the terms that people use themselves. So in history, what was important in terms of critical thinking was about argument, but it was also about looking at the context. Where did this happen? Who was involved? Who was there? What was going on in the background? Who's speaking? Who's not speaking? Are they wealthy people or poor people, country people, or... So that context was absolutely essential for the historians. That critical thinking was also about examining the complexities and ambiguities of the situation. All the things, because if it's a political speech, what's the subtext there? Who's being considered and who's not being considered? What's the message? What's the purpose? Who's got the power and who hasn't got the power? Historians were interested in the ideological, political, the game playing, the things that also were not being said, either deliberately or because they just weren't on the agenda. So historians were very interested in the unsaid and the gaps and silences, who had a voice and who didn't have a voice. And, as I said earlier, they were very interested in the examination of their own theorising. So critical thinking, and historians said critical thinking is history. This is the absolute core business of what we are as historians, is being critical thinkers. The rest is sort of important, but what we are as critical thinkers, that was their argument. For the physicists, critical thinking, at least for undergraduates, now as I say, it's very different for postgraduates, but at least for teaching undergraduates, it was about accuracy, it was about examination of accuracy, examination of uncertainty, examination of the powers of prediction, of assumptions, about process and protocol, experimental process. Is this rigorous? Is it? Are they considering what they should be considering? But also about the frontiers of knowledge, about the areas of debate and uncertainty within the discipline. But I think that category for undergraduates was more difficult. For economics, it was about logic and problem solving. They were the terms that economists used. It was about examination of policy and the uses of economics for policy. But really, for the economists that I spoke to, critical thinking was the use of the economic tools. Has the right tool being used in the right way? Is modelling being done in the right way? For law, it was again about the examination of an argument, evidence, and logic, examination of assumptions. Also the awareness of the social context. Ethical issues were very important, so critical thinking for lawyers was also very much about their own professional role, their professional ethics, the purpose of doing law and the responsibilities that lawyers had. And a questioning of received wisdom. Okay, this is what we've been told, but is this the case? It's our role as legal academics to examine this and say, is this actually what we think or should think or do think? And for medicine, the most important thing was clinical reasoning. Being able to follow that process of taking a history, understanding the pathology, understanding the anatomy and physiology, making a diagnosis, and then thinking about the therapeutic treatment options. And those steps they have been greatly researched and are well understood by medical academics. And that was the central role of critical thinking, is understanding that process. But it was also about the use of evidence-based medicine, understanding that and understanding the flaws. With statistics you can do all sorts of wonderful things, particularly if you've got drug company money behind you. So actually thinking about what is this clinical trial? Oh, it's all men of 40 and above. Do we start worrying about that? You know, it's the same drug abuse for women, old people, children? Thinking about their own role as professionals, and that was something that they took very seriously as critical thinkers. The psychosocial context and the questioning of received wisdom, but although medical academics were very anxious to encourage questioning of received wisdom in their students, they also argued that that was extremely difficult in the medical context because it's a hierarchical profession and hospitals are extremely hierarchical, and so it was very difficult for students to learn to question the consultant in the white coat who maybe was doing some things that they thought were not quite right, but how do you actually learn to critique that in a diplomatic, way that you're not going to get your head cut off? So I came to the conclusion that history as a contested discipline, an open discipline that was drawing on many other disciplines. It had a very interdisciplinary sense. It was drawing on cultural studies, on social theory, on economics, on histories and philosophy of science. Critical thinking was multiple, multi-layered, and absolutely essential to what history was. Physics had that interesting duality between certainty and uncertainty. Again, at least amongst the physicists that I spoke to, it was a very open discipline. That the physicists were collaborating with engineers, with computer scientists, with chemists, and so had drawn, again, quite a sophisticated understanding of the multi-layered nature of critical thinking in their own discipline, but that it was highly problematic at undergraduate level because students just needed the time to mature and to learn the technical skills. And they couldn't, and in fact many argued shouldn't, be examining the fundamentals of the discipline before they knew anything about it. And fair enough too. And then economics, at least in the universities that I was in, was a much more closed discipline. That many of the people that I spoke to said economics is right. We are correct. And was much more limited for undergraduates again to problem solving, to learning the techniques and manipulating the tools. Again, I'm just talking about undergraduates. I had to draw the line somewhere. Law, critical thinking was about, again, a range of levels, and medicine were highly complex epistemologies around both science, social science, ethics, professional behaviour, but at the same time a need for action. That people in medicine couldn't spend a lot of time thinking about things because they had to make a decision, and in the case of being in the emergency room of a hospital, make a decision right then and there. So there was both that need for thoughtfulness, but the need for action, on-the-spot action. So as one person said, yes, we want them to critique, yes, we want them to think, but we don't want them to be paralysed post-structuralists. There's no room for that in medicine. So I came up with a very tentative typology, and I'm actually myself fairly wary of typologies, and I think this is very open to being shot down in flames, and I'd be very happy if you felt like shooting it down. But I came up with the categories which probably echo the categories that I talked about earlier, which was that critical thinking can be about a straight, argumentation about using logico-deductive reasoning. It can be paradigmatic reasoning within the technical frameworks, using the tools of a particular discipline. Some disciplines, obviously, like economics or physics, lend themselves to that paradigmatic reasoning much more than, say, history, which is just picking, and my own discipline, higher education, which is picking bits from everywhere, really, as it suits us, much more eclectic disciplines. I think critical thinking can also be thought about as post-normal science, as that awareness which is used now in climate science, environmental science, more, is that idea of awareness of the complexities and uncertainties. Again, I don't think we would necessarily separate these three out as discrete, and then meta-critique or interdisciplinary, superdisciplinary critique. So the ability to move beyond our own disciplinary paradigms and examine it from outside. Now, I think, as I said, some disciplines like history do that naturally anyway, because they're so eclectic, they're drawing on other people's ideas. And I think this has some serious implications, this notion of what critical thinking is. And I probably would have to end by saying it's many things, and that's it. But I think this has some really serious implications at university levels, in terms of, I know my own university, we have a statement of our students' graduate attributes which says rather grandly that they will be good critical thinkers. And I absolutely believe that being a good critical thinker is what universities should be setting out to do. But what we mean by that, in our own contexts, I think is something that we need to examine and perhaps articulate. And all I'm really doing here is to start articulating that in some areas in a very inexpert way. But that, as members of departments, perhaps we need to start saying, okay, for us, this is what our aims are for our students, that we hope, as people in law, or as people in the business school, or as chemists, or whoever we are, educators, this is what we believe critical thinking can be for our students. I think it's also important that we engage in dialogues with employers, because I think, again, these grand statements that many universities have, maybe Iceland is less prone to do that than Australians, but I think employers think, oh yes, universities are supposed to teach their students to think critically, but I don't think we've always talked to employers about what we mean in a university context and what they hope we'll produce. So I think, again, there's a need for some dialogue, and I'm not necessarily arguing that we should always be producing what employers want. I don't think we're necessarily job factories. But, there needs to be a bit of conversation. And I think it has, going back to my own work, as a teacher in higher education and a teacher of my colleagues, that it's about thinking, okay, if one of our aspirations for our students is that they will be good critical thinkers, what are we actually doing in terms of articulating that to our students, thinking about how we actually teach it? Do we want it to be tacit and something that is picked up along the way, as somebody said, or do we want to be more explicit about that? Maybe both. I think they're both appropriate in different contexts. And if we want students to achieve these aspirations that we have for them, how do we assess it? Because if we don't assess it, well, we all know what students are like. It's not assessed. They don't think it's that important. So what messages are we giving to students? Do we actually believe things but then not assess? Do we believe things are important and then not assess them? Or do we assess them but not in ways that actually encourage them to think in the ways that we want them to think? So I think it opens up a number of puzzles for us to think about what we value, how we teach it, and then how we assess it. And that's all I have to say, and I'd be really interested in your comments.
That's a question related to your typology.
Do you want me to go back to it?
Well, you don't have to, but first for the audience. You put up 4 categories of argument, paradigmatic reasoning, post-normal science, and metacritic. And I was wondering, because even though I didn't write it down fully, but one of the sort of central idea that was common to the 5 disciplines was examination of assumptions.
Yeah.
Which is clearly a major aspect of critical thinking. But how would that fit into tentative typology? I don't see any...
No, I was actually thinking, it's interesting that you raised that, because I was thinking about that myself, and I mean, you could say that it fits in across all levels, but I mean, are you suggesting that it should be there as a separate? No, I'm not sure.
Well, perhaps I thought it might be most perhaps related to metacritic, but I thought perhaps knowing exactly what you mean by it. You mentioned Habermas, for example,
that would be a fundamental examination of fundamental assumptions, wouldn't it? Whereas I suppose somebody could argue that, at a sort of argument, at a more basic kind of logical level, you can examine assumptions. I mean, that's why I think it perhaps fits in.
But since you, in a way, didn't make a sharp distinction between argument and problem solving, I found that problematic, because problem solving is always aimed towards a particular accomplishment.
Yeah. But
argument is essentially open. It's an open argumentation and free argumentation.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So yeah, well, you asked us to be critical of this particular.
Oh, absolutely, and I think this
so I think you need to somehow revise this in relation to the responses of the 5 disciplines on this.
I do too. I mean, I think this is really dodgy, and I kind of, which is why I'm really, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right about problem solving, that it's different, isn't it, from skill thing. Yeah. I mean, I think I've got problem solving in the second, at the second level as paradigmatic reasoning, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not even. I mean, maybe it's a separate entity altogether. Problem solving. I mean, problem solving is what's used in some paradigmatic reasoning, but not all. Just anything for you to think of? Oh, no, that's great. Yeah, I'm really grateful.
Yeah. Thank you. First, I'd like just to know, what the 2 universities, these traditional Australian, which universities are they?
For ethical reasons, I probably can't say. No. Okay. They're both in Melbourne.
Okay.
You can work it out.
All right.
They're both big.
I agreed. I'm a historian, and I agreed with most of what you said. Especially about historians are very aware that they are the ones making history. What I didn't understand was really what you said about medicine when you were discussing that it was, is it a discipline or is it not, and the difference between an oncologist and a pediatrician. And I'm just wondering, what is the difference? I mean, all doctors must have the same basic training, basic education. Just like, for instance, a historian, let's say a social historian of ancient Rome, or an economic historian of Putin's Russia. I mean, they have the basic the same, and they will understand each other if they give talks.
Oh, absolutely.
What's the difference between, in medicine? There's tremendous sort of gap or whatever we should call it between an oncologist and a pediatrician? Can't they understand each other or what?
Oh, absolutely.
They belong to the same
yes, I mean,
discipline?
certainly. Yes, I mean, all of them argue that there is a discipline called medicine, and undergraduates, it's common.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The 6 years that our students do a medical degree they all do the same thing. But what they were saying is that at level of specialties, it's very, certainly a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and an oncologist understand the basics, but that's it. So they've absolutely got a common basic understanding. But medicine is so specialised now that somebody in one specialty wouldn't know the details. They would know the basics of, how a tumour forms and what it means, but they wouldn't know the complexities or the recent research or, the modern drug treatments.
I was wondering, doesn't that apply to all disciplines?
Yeah.
And just one more. You talked about the art of medicine. You only mentioned art once. What's so artistic about medicine?
It was a term used by them, and they said it's both an art and a science. I think actually it's perhaps more a craft and a science. But they said it's about having an empathy with your patients. It's about perception. It's about being able to speak differently to, to a child. When you have a child sitting in front of you, it's about understanding how to relate to a child. And then when you have an 80-year-old grandma who doesn't speak English as a first language, and being out somebody who's deaf, that
I understand.
human,
The human touch.
yes, and that, sort of perception, understanding, kindness, knowing with a smile.
Well, what are much textbooks came up in your interviews? I was studying textbooks and teachers' attitudes and use of textbooks. And I would say there are two types, talking about typology. One is a textbook as, by nature, the opposite of critical thinking. And the other one is, you use textbook, of course, but you don't use critical thinking when you read it. I've had history students who are very used to critical thinking and all sorts of documents and so on, but when they come to the textbook, they forget about it. And so it's also a question of transferability. So, did come up.
One of them said we worry that we teach them as if the textbooks are the answers. So yes, he did. I think you're right. That a lot of them said we don't teach them to critique textbooks, and that the students themselves want the answers. They want to know that the answer is there on page 42 if they need it. I think that's up to us.
So the content of a textbook cannot be critical.
Oh, well.
I mean, what the teachers thought.
No, I don't think they were suggesting that at all. I think they were suggesting that it was their own failing in tending to suggest to students that the textbooks were the answer. But none of them said they shouldn't be critical. No, I think it was more that they were saying we've done our students a bit of a disservice by suggesting that on their shelves are the answers. Because obviously.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, but because I did a research on university teachers' ideas, curriculum ideas, and it's a quote from my research where a academic within engineering, I was asking him to explain to me what was the good student within this discipline. And he said, I found it when we were discussing this book, and the books in the undergraduate engineering.
they are huge and they kind of cover everything, the teaching methods, the assessment. And he said, the good student, he said, now I know why this is such a good book, because the answering sheets in the back are so full of mistakes. And the good student is the one who does the problem and then goes and finds that the answer doesn't fit. And instead of changing his solution, he criticizes and says, well, this book has to be wrong. And that was the example of a very good critical student within engineering. That's the one who doubts the book.
It seems to me from this that it has turned out to be rather difficult to find the common features of critical thinking in all those disciplines. So I was wondering if it might be more fertile, maybe you consider that, to look at the negation. What is it like to be uncritical? There may be more common features between an uncritical historian and an uncritical physicist and so on than the critical ones. Uncritical thinking for us means something well, believing in authority and taking things at surface value and so on and so forth. So that might have been easier. Did you look at this often?
No, I think it would have been easier. I'm not normally in the habit of taking the easy way out, but perhaps I should have. I think it would be difficult actually, because it would have been more difficult to get my academic colleagues to admit when they were being uncritical, perhaps.
I'm sorry I came in late, so I missed how you were introduced. But I was wondering of your own background, because if you, for example, now we are talking about the knowledge being contextualized and situated, but when we have a discipline like cognitive psychology, for example, where my basic training is in, which is, where critical thinking is a, lively research field. So I was wondering whether you actually reflect these findings, in those kind of research. I mean, what does these findings tell, in comparison with research of psychologists, cognitive psychologists of critical thinking?
I mean, I think I have to admit that it's very much reflectivisms of my own ways of seeing the world. I mean, my own background is, my first degree is political science, and then I was a teacher for a while, and now my field is higher education. I certainly did look at the literature on, the cognitive science literature on critical thinking, and absolutely there were, I'm sure you know this literature better than I, but there were clear descriptors about what critical thinking was. And yes, and I think some of them are reflected in some of the disciplines, and all of them are reflected in some of the disciplines. But coloured, I suppose, by what's valued in the departmental disciplinary cultures. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's interesting because on one hand we might say, okay, maybe we are not using the best knowledge there is in critical thinking in our disciplines, or we could say that research field is so isolated because it doesn't look well enough into the contextuality or the situatedness of knowledge. And it's interesting to have a debate between there.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of my colleagues in my own department, he has done quite a lot of research from a more cognitive psychology. His PhD is in psychology, and looking at critical thinking. And he and I sort of argued backwards and forwards, because he argues that there are simple, clear elements of critical thinking. They can be identified. They can be taught, regardless of the context. He's developed quite an interesting online tool for teaching students to do this. but he's only run it in social sciences. I said, why don't you take it to the Department of Mathematics and see how they deal with it? Because I think their way of thinking is, and their way of using, I mean, they're using it symbolically, not in words anyway, even if they're doing the same thing. So, so, I mean, I can't really answer your question except to say I think it's going backwards and forwards.
Would you suggest there would be a healthy thing to do for different disciplines, to sit down and discuss what do we mean by critical thinking? What do you think that would be the end of the disciplinary community within that university?
No, police we can't understand each other. What's the point? I think it would be fantastic. We might not come to a. I mean, I don't think we'll come to a consensus. Do we need to? No, I mean, I think it would be wonderful if we did.
Or maybe people are.
I mean,
within one discipline, I don't know if that is
Yeah.
common
I mean, even
discussion
if
within different disciplines. Do we discuss that in different disciplines? What do we mean by critical thinking? How do we promote it with our students? How do we assess it? Do we ever do that? We don't do it very much within our discipline.
I don't know. I mean, I think even if we go away with a sharper idea of what we value, and we talk to people who value something different.
I'm a physicist, also doing history of science. I think we would do this by example, from history, for example, from the history of physics. We have many examples of the role of critical thinking. I mean, scientists like Einstein and Paul, some of the most famous ones, can be produced as, I mean, their characteristic feature is being critical. Being critical to the fundamentals of the discipline at that time. So it's, I mean, it's obvious to me that critical thinking in physics is very important.
But it's probably like with Anna says, if you might say Einstein was a very good critical thinker, but how do we then have our students think like Einstein? At the undergraduate level.
We can at least show the example of whereby indirectly inducing them to try and do the same, or something similar.
So I wonder about the distinction between undergraduate and graduate level, because it seems to me that the assessment of critical thinking is much easier at the graduate level in most fields, I gather. It's not because you have the thesis, you have the participation in the field and so on, you have discussions with your mentor and so on. But I see the problem being the undergraduate level. And I think there is much difference between disciplines, because I said, for example, in the physical sciences, I come to the biosciences. Only at the undergraduate level, there is the demand for critical thinking is less. So I wonder if you had any suggestions on how it could be increased.
Well,
I have one if you don't have any.
I'm not an expert in the biosciences, so I guess I hasten to try and tell you anything about an area that you might know much better than I. I mean, the literature that I read on, say, physics education and biology education was about getting students to, the open-ended problems, the ill-structured problems, and so you suggested also getting people to think about the philosophy of the discipline as well as the content. But that is extremely difficult, I think, when you've got limited time and, with the mature sciences, a lot of material to get through. That, I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's easier with graduate degrees is that they've already mastered the basics, and so you can then engage in a more sophisticated level of critique, perhaps. But then, for the students who will only do what we call a pass degree and then go out into the wide world, are we doing them a disservice by not teaching them to think more critically? I mean, most of our students who do science degrees don't go on to do postgraduate. So are we producing a lot of people who are perhaps more naive than we would like them to be?
So I think one thing that's important in the physical and the biosciences is that the importance of the lecture is always textbook and lecturing. And I think it's very important to increase critical thinking, to have discussion groups, which is quite rare in the sciences. Sometimes don't understand this when they come from other sciences.
I know in my university they're introducing problem-based, certainly in some areas, much more problem-based learning, where students are actually having to work together to solve ill-structured problems and doing it together and thinking about what they don't know, what they need to know, and so there's much more uncertainty built in. But that's more time-consuming.
Yes, but I think your point is excellent for this lack of assessment of something that everybody thinks is very important.
Yeah, I think we all agree that it's important.
One final question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture and raising more questions and providing answers and everything. But I just want to ask you, if a person, ordinary person comes and not a scholar comes to you and asks what is critical thinking? How would you answer?
I would say, which discipline do you come from?
But then another point, it seems to me that in a way it's very interesting what the question that Thorsten raised here about being uncritical, namely the biases of theoretical thinking, but the connection with some epistemological virtues, which I think is absolutely fundamental. I think it's very difficult to really to deal with critical thinking in a way without taking into account a set of epistemological virtues that are required, which are related to understanding the biases of theoretical thinking, which are different from discipline to discipline, which came out very clearly and interestingly there. So my question, in a way, what I'm thinking about here is that for me, in a way, critical thinking you have to take into account both some technical aspects of it, skills that are related to it, or whether they are the same, and then another aspect which I think is more or less the same, which is the moral dimension, moral aspects of critical thinking, which I believe is the same in all disciplines. I don't wonder what you want to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually just started thinking about the moral dimension. I mean, and I think you're probably right. I mean, certainly the two disciplines where the ethical issues came up, they were similar. They were about professional practice and what that meant. They were about the implications for, human beings, for society. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I have to say I haven't thought about it a lot yet. But I think you might be right. There may be a common element there. But having done a little bit of moral philosophy at university, it's a big and scary area.
I think we have run out of time. I would like to thank you, Anna, for a very good presentation and giving, like Háskólanum said, leaving us with more answers, more questions than answers. This probably is how all lectures should end, to increase critical thinking with our students, probably a good starting point at least. And I would like to thank all of you for participating and being here today. Thank you.